Takeaways from Shavuot in challenging times. We've just celebrated the Chag of Shavuot, Zman Matan Terasenu, in a time which was somewhat challenging and somewhat confusing. We had, prior to Shavuot, we had Rahman Aslan, the tragedy in Meron. We had the war breaking out in Eretz Yisrael. Our tefillos are for the residents, for Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael and throughout the world constantly. We had the tragedy of the collapse of the stands and the Beis Medrash in Eretz Yisrael. Challenging times, confusing times. What is a takeaway from Shavuot with the backdrop of these difficult times that we're experiencing? We know, of course, on Shavuot that we lein Megillas Ruos. Several reasons are given why we lein Megillas Ruos on Shavuot, and one, of course, is that on Shavuot was the Yartzeit of Dovid HaMelech, the late of Dovid HaMelech, and, of course, Dovid HaMelech, stam from Rus. She was the aim of the Malchus-based David. Now, we can ask a question. It seems to be quite perplexing. Rus had this tremendous Mesiras Nefesh. She was Meiser Nefesh for Yadus. She was Meiser Nefesh to come under the Ol HaTorah LaMitzvos. She was Meiser Nefesh for her Gerus. And it would seem, therefore, it's fitting that the Malchus-based David came from Rus. But what was missing in Klal Yisrael? What element was missing in Klal Yisrael that there was a Hashkafa, an addition from Rus? Yes, she had unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh, but Klal Yisrael already had the Amudim of Mesiras Nefesh. They had the Yesodis of Mesiras Nefesh. Was there anything missing from the Mesiras Nefesh of the Avos? We had the Kishana Eish, we had Lech Lecha, we had the Akedah. Is there any greater Mesiras Nefesh than the Akedah? So what was this added dimension that Rus HaMoaviyah added and brought to Klal Yisrael, to Am Yisrael, that we already didn't have? The Yesodis of our Avos. We had Kriyas Yamsuf, we had Lech Tech Acharei B'Midbar, we had all of these unbelievable Yesodis of Mesiras Nefesh and Dveikus and Torah Mitzvahs. What was the addition of Rus HaMoaviyah? So there happens to be a machlokes amongst the Meforshim. When did the Gerus of Rus take place? Rashi and Tosfos and the Medrash Tanchuma, they indicate that the Gerus took place only when she went with Naomi to Eretz Yisrael. That the marriage, Machlin and Kilian, that took place before their Gerus. They married them before they were in Skyer. The Zohar Chodesh says Chas v'Sholom, that Machlin and Kilian would marry Goyim. And the Ralbag and the Ben Ezra and other Meforshim similarly say that no, that the Gerus took place at the time of the Nesuim, at the time of their marriage to Machlin and Kilian. That's when the Gerus took place. So the Baal HaKedah asks, if so, it's so difficult to understand. How could Naomi encourage Rus and Orpah to go back? Shavna, go back to your households. Don't leave your house. Go back. They would therefore have a din of a mesis Mediach. They would therefore have a din of a mesis Mediach, that they would be enticing and encouraging them to leave Yadus, to go back and go back to their household of Avodah Zorah. How could Naomi possibly try to encourage and entice these Gerim to go back to their Avodah Zorah? How could that possibly be? It's brought down in the Griz Chodesh, the new edition of the Griz, that a possible teretz, that the original Gerus was as a Ger Toshav. Not as full Gerus, but as a Ger Toshav, that's Mekabel Zayin Mitzvahs. And therefore, Machlin and Kilian were permitted to marry them. because he maintained that the Isra of Loisis Chatim does not apply to a Ger Taisha. So they had a din of a Ger Taisha. Machlon and Kir were permitted to marry them, but when it came time to be going back to Eretz Yisrael, they were not Yidden. So, therefore, Naomi could encourage them to go back. The son of the Brisker Rav Dovid Zatzal, said, Tomani Ma'oid. It's very difficult to understand. Firstly, there are those who hold, the Minchas Chinuch hold that the Isra V'Leisis Chatim does apply. It does apply to even a Ger Toshev. It applies to a Ger Toshev that you cannot marry them unless there's a full Geras. But even according to those who say that no, the Isra V'Leisis Chatim does not apply to a Ger Toshev, but nevertheless, he brings down the Rambam Parshas Hilchos Malachim that says that Moshe Rabbeinu's mitzvah to command the Umas and the Zayin mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, and if they refuse to be Makablim, they're Chayav Misa. So how could Naomi, even if they were only Gerei Toshev, how could Naomi entice them, encourage them to go back? Perhaps we can answer this based on a different Brisker Rav. We know that Doeg HaAdoimi tried to passel David HaMelech, tried to say that David HaMelech was passel, could not come to the Kahal, could not certainly not be a Melech. He was not even allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael because he stammed from Rus HaMoaviyah, and there was an Isser to intermarry with anyone from Moav. Ad Shabo Yisra Yisraeli, Va'omar Yeharig B'cherev, whoever does not listen to me, Yeharig B'cherev, shall be killed by the sword. Kach mekublani mi beis dina shel Shmuel haramosi, that the halach is Moavi v'loi Moaviyah, that the Isser of marrying into Moav is only for the males and not for the females. Moavi v'loi Moaviyah. The Chasam Sefer Marsha, they ask a question, how is it possible that this dispute came up so much later at the time of David HaMelech, that at the time of David HaMelech they were still disputing this halacha of Moavi v'loi Moaviyah? We know that generations earlier, that Boaz married Rus, and Boaz was a shayfet. He was a gadol ador. He married Ruth. So how could it possibly be that they have this controversy, this dispute, so many generations, so many years later? And we know the Gemara says that Boaz gathered 10 people. He gathered about 10 people to be mefarsem, to publicize this halacha of Moavi v'loi Moaviyah. So why was this in dispute at the time of David HaMelech? Says the Brisker Rav that Bezdin HaGadol, they paskin halachas in two different ways. One way that they paskin the halacha is based on their droshes. On the droshes of the Yud Gimel Midas, they make droshes, they darshan based on Yud Gimel Midas, and they come up with a conclusion. The second way is based on a Kabbalah, on halacha l'Moshe Misinai, on a Kabbalah. And the difference between them is that if it's a drosha based on Yud Gimel Midas, if it's their drosha, another bezdin can argue and dispute it and overturn it. If a bezdin is worthy of it, they can argue. But if it's based on a Kabbalah, on halach l'Moshe Misina, they can't argue on that. So therefore, he says that Boaz, he paskined that the halach is Moavi v'lo Moaviyah. But he didn't have a Kabbalah. He based it on his drosha. Came years later, Doeg HaAdoimi, and he disputed this drosha. He disputed it. He said, no, it's not correct. And he had the capability of arguing. Ad Sheba Yisrael, and he says, no, kach mikublani mi beis dina shel Shmuel. This is not, I have a Kabbalah. Not only a svara, not only a drosha, I have a Kabbalah. It's a Kabbalah from the beis din of Shmuel Haramosi, that Moav v'loi Moaviyah, and therefore you cannot argue on it. It's a Kabbalah and you can't argue. And at that point in time, it was established. It was not something that was subject to dispute. That the halacha is Moavi v'loi Moaviyah. And he says, therefore, it comes out, it's very geschmack. when Boaz approached the Goyal, Pliny Almighty, to marry Rus, to be Goyal the Sodom to marry Rus, he says he cannot do it because how will I destroy my nachlosi, which the Rashi brings down, means my zari. How will I destroy my generations, my children? They'll be posol tlovul kahal. Why was he only concerned about his children? If there was an isser of marrying a Moaviah, then it would apply to him as well. Why would it be only concerning his children? But it says, according to this approach of the Brisker Rav, he says that, yes, Boaz had a drosha. Yes, Boaz had a svara. And the Goyal was willing to accept it. But future generations, who knows, maybe another Bezin will not accept it. And therefore his children will be chutz l'kahal. His children will be outside the kahal, and will be possible to enter to marry inside of Klal Yisrael. Ech roses nachlosi. So therefore he refused. Based on this understanding, perhaps we can understand what the pshat is, the Zohar Chodesh, and those who say that there was a gerus prior to Naomi and Ruth going back to Eretz Yisrael. How could Naomi try to encourage Ruth and Orpah to leave and to go back to their households? Why wasn't that Mesus and Mediach? How can they try to entice them to leave Yiddishkeit if they were Gerim? Perhaps Pshat is as follows. Elimelech was a Godel Ador, and he paskind that Moavi v'lo Moaviyah, and his children, Machlim and Killian, relied on his psak, and therefore they were Megayer, Rus and Orpah. They were Megayer them. They were Megayer, Rus and Orpah. And it was a gerus. But something unexpected happened. Something that they did not anticipate happened, that Elimelech died. And Machlin died. And Killian died. And they ran into poverty. And they were impoverished. And suddenly the situation changed in Eretz Yisrael. The situation turned in Eretz Yisrael. It changed. And they were going to go back. And now Naomi is wondering, yes, they were Megayer. Yes, that Ruth and Orpah were Megayer, but they were thinking that they would be able to marry, they would marry Jewish husbands. And even if their husbands died, they'd find other husbands. And now suddenly there's a situation where all of the males in the family, the heads of the household, Elimelech, Machlin and Killian, they died. And the psak of Elimelech could not be carried further. They would go back to Eretz Yisrael. Who knows if in Eretz Yisrael they would accept this psak? And not only that, perhaps even it would be accepted, another Bezdin would come and overturn that psak. And suddenly now they'd be facing a situation where they could not marry any Yidden they could not marry. Did they really anticipate this when they were Makabel their Gerus? Perhaps the entire Gerus was betos, was a mistake. It was under a false pretext. They thought they'd be able to marry Jewish husbands, and now they possibly would not be able to marry a Jewish husband. Perhaps it was a betos. It was a Gerus betos, perhaps. So now Naomi has to go through the process again and say, go back. To determine if the gerus is a valid gerus. And now there's a pretext. Because they can say, I didn't accept gerus on this basis. I didn't accept gerus on the basis that I wouldn't be able to have a husband. So now she has to go through the process again and test them to determine if their gerus is genuine. Now, knowing what they know now, that perhaps they will not be able to marry, are they still willing to accept the gerus? And if not, then it's not a question of Mesus Mediach. The gerus was not a gerus, it was betos. They never were gerim. So that's what she was trying to determine, to see if the gerus was valid, and if they would say, as Orpah did, that no, she can't accept it. She never was Megayer. It never was a gerus. And therefore it fits in very well why Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah, do I have more children? Do I have more children that I can give to you? I don't have any children, any other children. I'm too old to have any other children. Why is that relevant? Why is Naomi saying, do I have any other children? Well, why do they have to marry her children? They can marry any other children. Why is she stressing that? Do I have b'mei? Do I have any other children? Because according to this approach, we understand it very well, because if she had other children, they would be able to rely on the psak of Elimelech, and they would be able to marry them, but she doesn't have other children. They have to go to Eretz Yisrael. They have to find other husbands who could not or don't rely on the psak of Elimelech, and perhaps they will never find a husband. So then, therefore, the gerus would not be a gerus. And that's why she tested it out. Now, perhaps we can, with this, understand and have an answer to the question that we began with. What is added with the Rus, with the gerus of Rus, with the Mesiras Nefesh of Rus? From on that foundation is built the Malchus Beis Dovid that we didn't have in Klal Yisrael already. What is the Rus HaMoaviyah? What is she adding to the Kabbalas Ol HaTorah and the mitzvahs, the Mesiras Nefesh and Klal Yisrael, that Klal Yisrael didn't already have from the Avos, from our forefathers, with all of their unimaginable Mesiras Nefesh? Perhaps the pshat is as follows: that it's one thing to have Mesiras Nefesh when you're the chosen one. It's one thing to have Mesiras Nefesh when it's B'nai B'char Yisrael, when it's V'avarecha, V'hei Bracha, V'agadla, V'agadla Shemecha, and L'cho Atenes Haaretz Azayis, when you are the chosen one, when it's you are the chosen one of the Rabbeinu Shalom, and it's Mesiras Nefesh, but Mesiras Nefesh knowing that you belong to the Am Hashem, that you are Mamleches Kohanim V'goy Kodesh, that you are the special ones of the Rabbeinu Shalom, the treasured ones of the Rabbeinu Shalom. Yes, Mesiras Nefesh is unbelievable, and the Mesiras Nefesh of the Avos we can't begin to imagine, but that was a getter of, yes, but you are my chosen one. There's a different element of Mesiras Nefesh when it's Mesiras Nefesh and you're an Oisvorf. You're Chutz L'machana. You can't intermarry. You can't be part of the Kahal. You can't not be a melech. You can't not only not be a melech, you can't even intermarry. You're apostle, you're chutz l'machna. That's a different element of Mesiras Nefesh. And that's what Rus HaMoaviyah brought to Klal Yisrael. She rejected her household. She rejected the Avodah Zorah of her household. She overturned herself inside out. The whole Yesod of Moav was Asher lo kin lachem b'lechem v'mayim, anti-chesed. Lot, the forefather of Moav, he separated from Avram Avinu. He porayed Lloyd. He separated from Avram Avinu, from the chesed of Avram Avinu, anti-chesed Sdaim. That was Moav. She, the greatest, biggest Balas Chesed, Rus, turned herself inside out to be a Balas Chesed, to follow Nomi, and be Dovik B'Torah, knowing that she possibly will never be able to marry and she'll be Chutz L'machna. That's the Yesod of the Melech. That a Melech perseveres. The Melech is the king in the face of all kinds of difficulties, but even in the face of being rejected. That's the Yesod of David HaMelech. Lulei Seiroscha, Sh'ashuei Azavarati Ba'ani. In his poverty, he was rejected. He was a nirdaf. But Lulei Seiroscha. Az Gershuni Yom Mistapeach Benachlas Hashem. I was rejected. I was thrown out, being part of Nachlas Hashem. But nevertheless, he came from Rus, my Rus, the Gemara Darshan's Rus. Al Shem Sheriva LaKodesh Baruch Hu V'Shiras V'Tishbach Sheyotzim Menu David, that came from her David Sheriva LaKodesh Baruch Hu V'Shiras V'Tishbach, that satiated the Rabbi Shem with all kinds of praise and all kinds of matzovim, whatever the situation. The Gemara Darshan, the Pia Pascha B'Chachma, that Shlomo Melech said this, Al Shem David Aviv, referring to David, his father. Shadar b'chamisha Elomi, he lived in 5 worlds and said Shira, whatever the situation, whatever the masav, in the light and the darkness and the despair, he said Shira, and that's the Yesod of the Malchus Beis David. And that is the element of Kabbalas HaTorah and Kabbalas Al Mitzvah, to be Makabal when we're B'nai B'char Yisrael, to be Makabal when it's Vatam Tila Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh, to be Makabal when it's Eschem Al Kanfei Neshorim, but also to be Makabal when it's chutz l'machna, when it's Gershuni Hayom Mistapech Menachlas Hashem, when it's Darba Chamisha Elomim. And that's the ultimate Kabbalah of Torah. And we're living in a time when we see great Shefa, we see great Bracha, we see Atem HaMelachas Kohanim Goy Country, but we also see the darkness and the despair and the confusion. And let us be mispalel that this darkness and confusion are the Chevlei Leida of Mashiach, the pains before we see the ultimate light, the pains of Mashiach. And let us hope with the Kabbalah Shlema to be Makabel, the Torah Mitzvahs, and Alam Atzavim. When the light shines, and Rahman al-Islam in the darkness and the confusion, a complete shleimus of Kabbalah's Torah mitzvahs, that this taka will be the Chevlei Leida that we'll see, B'Korav. The Gilui Koyet Shechina, the Mamlachas Beis Dovid B'Melua, when Ben David comes, V'Yigalenu, to bring us to the Binyan Beis HaMikdash Meher V'Yamein.